I am being watched. Welcome everyone to Mailfuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about Person of Interest, Season 2, Episode 7. It's called Critical. So spoilers for the episode, as always. Once again, this show finds some new ways to shake up the formula, do something different. It kind of does it in two different ways this time. Both in the basic concept of the Person of Interest this time, which is this surgeon who is doing open heart surgery on a really important patient, this guy who owns an energy company. I say important, what I really mean is filthy rich, right? He owns a big company. And she has been threatened, or more specifically, her wife Amy is being threatened with murder. Who doesn't know any of this is going on? Amy has no idea her life is in danger, but they've got like snipers and stuff like trained on her. And it's like, if you don't kill this guy while you're doing surgery, if you don't just nick an artery and let him die on the table, then your wife is dead. That is the basic setup of this episode. I think that already sounds pretty unique for this show. It sounds a little bit different than things we've had before. We've dealt with some of these themes before. The idea of a doctor having to sort of possibly challenge their oath to heal people. In this way, it's out of a coercion rather than a temptation of revenge. But I would say this is largely a pretty new setup for the show. I think the episode then kind of shakes it up again once it actually gets into the meat of who the villain is. So we have this English guy named Wesley, played by Julian Sands, and he, it turns out, is very prepared and very competent at what he's doing. There's a whole thing in the middle of this episode where Reese decides, okay, we know we've got this camera feed of the wife Amy in the park. She's at like a fair, and she's being targeted by seemingly a sniper. Reese goes to the park, finds where this sniper is, and takes him out. And then almost immediately after he does so, the guy's phone rings, and it's Wesley saying, "I don't know who you are, stranger, but you've interfered with something here." And it turns out that there's multiple snipers, there's multiple people in the park who can kill her at any time. So he asks Reese to come and have a chat, come and have a drink. And he's very capable. He deduces very quickly that Reese is probably ex-CIA, that he's very skilled. Reese equally deduces some of Wesley's background as possibly being from MI6 and whatever else. So it's like, okay, you're giving us this very competent villain who is a good level above a lot of the villains that they've had to deal with on the show up until this point. He's very well prepared, and this part that I'm about to mention isn't really that unique necessarily for the people of interest, because typically a lot of the ones who are victims, sometimes the threats are from people they know, and they're not like huge shocks that they're being targeted by someone, but often they can be surprises. But I think in this case specifically, the way that the doctor lady comes into her office and Wesley's standing there and immediately starts laying out the rules and the threats against her wife, it felt like he entered her life just as suddenly and as shockingly as Reese typically enters the Person of Interest lives, right? The way he'll show up and be this protector, it felt like Wesley was very much the evil version of that, where he just shows up out of nowhere. Doctor lady has no idea who he is, but all of a sudden, within seconds, he's laid out this life or death game, this series of consequences that she now has to contend with. And if you think about how Reese jumps into the lives of the people that he helps, quite quickly, if he jumps in and like immediately fights someone in front of them and says, "Hey, we have to go, your life's in danger," he kind of puts them into a similar situation where they realize, oh crap, all of a sudden I have to be scared. All of a sudden I have to take this all very seriously. It just so happens that Reese is there to help them, as opposed to being the one who's laying down the threats. But I couldn't help but escape that comparison. And of course, Wesley is well dressed. He's a man in a suit, just like Reese is. So I thought that was a very interesting comparison point. So then we have this set up for the rest of the episode where they can't just go and get Amy because everyone's watching her. So we have to see how the characters figure their way around that, particularly Reese. How does he try and get a message to her or help her without it being in plain sight, because he knows that she's being watched. He also knows that he's now being watched to an extent, maybe not the whole time, but they know who to look for. They know Wesley knows who Reese is by face now. I mean, in fact, it turns out by the end he actually did cross paths with Reese, and he mentions that at the end when he says goodbye over the phone. And Reese doesn't remember this encounter. He remembers the location he's talking about, and it's kind of a little subtle thing that says, hey, this is why he's formidable, because he was able to be a part of Reese's life at one point with Reese never knowing it, which means that, hey, maybe he's a challenge for our main characters. That sets up the threat a little bit. So, not that I necessarily think we need another recurring villain on the show, because we actually have quite a lot of them, and the subplot of this episode deals with some of that stuff as well. But I can't deny, though, this was a very solid introduction of this character, and presented a very simple set of rules that the characters had to follow. There's a lot of the Doctor in the operating room stalling for time because she wants to try and give Reese that time to save her wife, and she doesn't want to kill someone. She took an oath, right? And that leads to some of the fun with Finch, because Finch is in the operating room with her, dressed up as a doctor, and the doctor lady's trying to pretend that he's supposed to be there, and that leads to some fun little bits and pieces of just, you know, just playing out the roles, I guess. I mean, honestly, if I have a critique for the main plot, it would probably just be that the culprits, I mean, not the main culprit, obviously it's Wesley, but there's a whole sub-bit where, oh, someone on the inside's leaking the information to him, and they think it's the rich guy's assistant, and because that's the first thing Finch thought, I was like, nah, it's probably not. And the only person it could really be is there was a nurse that's had a couple of lines of dialogue. It was one of those like TV writing things where, well, it has to be her because no one else in the episode has spoken. It has to be someone that we're going to vaguely recognize when they mention who it is. So, you know, that was a predictable element of it, but it's not, the plot doesn't really hinge on it. The plot's more the fun of like trying to play the game by the rules that the villains set up and get around them, which Reese ultimately does by sneaking her a phone and then talking to her on this phone that is not tapped by the villains and making her walk in all the locations that's avoiding all the cameras in the park, and ultimately getting her to somewhere where he can jump in and play the protector. Fusco also gets involved a little bit. He helps sort of cause a distraction, and he realizes actually that there's a fake cop, which I actually oddly predicted, and not in a way where I was trying to predict something, but Fusco goes to cause a distraction in the middle of the episode, and he does so by picking on this patrol police officer who's walking around the park, and I couldn't help but just have the idea that, what if this turns out to be actually one of the bad guys? Because we've set up by this point that the bad guys could be anyone in the park. And sure enough, it turned out to be the case where he finds out towards the end of the episode that, yeah, like there was only one policeman in the park and it's not him. And of course, they do a decent enough job of giving you a scene with the Doctor with her wife Amy at the start of the episode, so we can see that they're, you know, very loving with each other, they've got a good relationship. Just enough, not just for the audience, but also for the fact that Reese gets to see this as well. Because we do a whole little bit at the start of the episode where it's like, okay, is she a victim? Is the threat coming from her work? Is it coming from her personal life? And then they see her with her wife, and it's like, oh no, like they're a happy married couple. So where's the threat coming from? And hence the fun of Wesley just kind of appearing into the story very suddenly. But of course, what Wesley never counted on was that other people had already bugged her and were listening into the conversation. So this help came from this other source that he can't quite predict. In fact, Wesley doesn't really have a good answer for where Reese comes from or who he's working for. He just assumes that he's some extra level of secret security that the rich guy has that he didn't account for. But of course, that's not true. I should mention here, Wesley's played by Julian Sands, who I think I mainly know him from Arachnophobia, the movie, from the early 90s. But, you know, he's one of those actors who popped up in a lot of bit parts over the years. Sadly, as soon as I saw him, I think it just came into my head. The last time I heard about him was because early last year he went missing when he was hiking, I think. And he eventually turned up dead. He passed away last year. So it was a little bit bittersweet seeing him here and being like, oh wow, this is, it's not that long ago, really. It's it's just over a decade ago, but also he's just passed away, so there's a weird feeling to seeing him here, but he plays the role well. It's a fun enough character for what we get in this episode. I do wonder if we're going to get more of a proper game of chess between him and Reese down the line, or possibly even him and Finch. Like, maybe that could be interesting if he becomes aware that there's someone else helping Reese, and does he think he can outsmart both of them? Because it's a very interesting sort of character, this alternate Reese almost, to kind of come out. Obviously, the whole thing's just that they're going to earn a lot of money from the stocks of this guy's company tanking when he dies. So that's all. It's all just about money, because that's what it usually is about. Obviously, the other element that I've not mentioned yet in this episode is that with Finch at the hospital keeping an eye on the doctor lady, whilst Reese is at the park dealing with the wife, who's doing the research? Who's doing all the research back at the library to get the info and the details on all these people and all these money transfers? Well, it's Leon, of course. Who's Leon, you ask? Well, Leon was the character from the first episode of the season. He's back. In fact, the opening of the episode is a good little comedy beat where they say, hey, we've got a repeat number, and Reese says, who's dumb enough to get their life under threat twice? And then out through the window comes Leon. It's a really funny beat. I laughed quite a bit. I will say Reese's line about who's dumb enough to have their life threatened twice felt a bit weird, because it works for the punchline, don't get me wrong. It made Leon jump or being thrown out the window a second later really funny, but the people who are targeted on this show, it's not always their fault they're being targeted. Like, some of them are just important people in important positions, and it makes sense that they probably have numerous threats against them over their life or their career or whatever it may be. So, weird line on its own, but as part of the joke, it was quite funny. So they don't really have time to deal with him, so they just hide him at the library. They put a hood over his head so he doesn't know where it is. But he's hanging out there. He's not happy that he's eating Hot Pockets and living with a dog. But eventually they need some research done, so Finch gives him access to the computers. And it's a little bit fun just from a sort of meta perspective, because there's a point in this episode where Leon's got some info and he's telling Finch this, and he's kind of excited, and he says, oh, this is actually really fun. Is this what you guys do all the time? And it's a fun little moment, because it's almost like a fan of the show getting to interact with the ongoings. Not that he was a fan himself, but it kind of works on that meta level where it's an outsider coming in and getting to take part of the process. I wouldn't even count Fusco or Carter like that, because they're still prominent characters on the show who serve their own purpose on the show. Whereas Leon does feel like this true outsider who's coming in and getting a taste of what it's like, a day in the life of Reese and Finch. As for correlations to our main characters from the main plot and the villains and stuff, I made some obvious ones between Reese and Wesley already. I would say the idea that the Doctor's being forced to kill someone against her will, you could kind of tie that into Reese's backstory, but I don't know if it, they're not always going to tie in perfectly with something in the main character's backstories necessarily. Arguably it maybe ties in more with like some of the things Carter sometimes feels that she has to do that's kind of shady or under the radar. The most direct comparison is probably to the B plot in this episode, just because we come back to Agent Snow and the fact that he's been forced to do stuff under duress, and specifically he was forced to kill someone. We don't find that out until like halfway through the episode, though. It starts off as a bit of a mystery where Fusco's called to a crime scene, there's a dead body, but there's a Detective Carter business card in the victim's pocket. So Fusco pockets it, calls in Carter, and she then looks into this and like what this guy has to do with her. And there's an address, it turns out, on the back, which leads her to this other place where Snow's doing a thing, and she encounters him. And it does seem like Snow intentionally left that card on the victim so that Carter would come find him, right? And she would get some information about what's going on. And says very ominously to Carter, she's doing this, she's planning something. And Carter's like, who is she? What are you talking about? But it's very clear to her, though, that he is working under duress because he's got this bomb vest strapped to him. And then, of course, some gunshots from the darkness, and we get a glimpse of the woman in the distance, but Carter has no idea who this is. And that leads to the final scene of the episode where she's asking Reese. She explains what's happened with Snow, and that he's working for someone. And I do wonder if even Reese immediately understands who she is. Does he know that she's still alive, or is this something where he's still trying to put the pieces together himself? He doesn't seem that surprised to hear anything in this scene, admittedly. But Carter's wanting some answers, and Reese kind of he explains that she's still very much a normal person with a normal life, as normal as it can be anyway, being a detective, but she still has a son, she still has a family life that she goes back to every day, and that's something that Finch and himself don't have, and that kind of makes it more acceptable to them, or makes it possible for them to do what they do. And that maybe Carter getting too close to some of this information might sort of cross a line where it puts the rest of her life in some kind of jeopardy, right? So it ends on this kind of downbeat, kind of ominous note of like, does Carter really want to know more? Obviously, she's got an inquisitive mind. She's always investigated things, even things that she's not doing for her job, because she has that thirst for knowledge. She wants to know what's going on. She wants to understand the situation. But they're at this kind of crossroads where maybe this is going to put her too deep into this world that might put her and possibly her son in danger. So it's a very important little beat for the ongoing plot of this background plot that's going on. The subplot itself in the episode is perfectly fine. I think I enjoyed the mystery element of it. But I wouldn't say any of the scenes stood out particularly compared to maybe other examples of some of these scenes. I did enjoy pretty much everything in the main story quite a bit, though. Like I said, I think even just the setup before they introduced who the villain and how competent the villain was, I thought it was already an interesting setup, because it was this idea of protecting a second person that related to the first person. But then on top of that, you then have this mastermind type villain who's accounted for any sort of interference and has a lot of dominoes in place that if one topples over, the murder will still happen. And I think that was a good bit of fun. If anything, I could have even done with more of like Reese having to try and figure out how to get one up over him. As it is, like, I still think it's a really entertaining episode, and I do also really appreciate the fact that our doctor character, who, by the way, I never really caught her name, because they say Amy a lot, because Amy's the wife, and they're all constantly saying, Amy's in trouble, we'll kill your wife Amy, all that stuff. But the doctor is just always referred to as the doctor, for the most part. But Dr. Enright is her name. I do appreciate that in order to give her a good little character story in this episode, that we build up to a moment where she chooses not to murder the man that she's been told to murder. And she doesn't know when she says that her wife's going to be okay. She's not in like protection completely yet. She knows that there's attempts being made to try and save her, but it's not like a done deal yet, and she still makes the choice not to kill him. She still can't go through with it. And I think that was a really important beat for the episode, because it made her feel like more of a full character than just the device that's there for the plot to happen around. It made it feel like she made a proactive choice that made her feel like she's this moral, strong character that made a tough decision, even though it might affect everyone else in her life. And yeah, so no, interesting. It's interesting stuff. And actually, now that I'm saying this, like, this is why I like talking about shows and movies, because sometimes when you're talking through something, you start to maybe hit on other things that you didn't think about when you were watching the episode. And the thought that just occurred to me is that earlier on I compared Wesley to Reese in that he's a man in the suit who shows up out of nowhere. It's just that he's there to do something bad to someone's life rather than something good. Right? And we were talking about Carter and how she's at this crossroads where getting more involved might put her regular life at risk. It's interesting that this episode had revolved entirely around someone like being forced to make a choice in their job where they're maybe having to cross this line that they don't want to cross, but doing so will affect the people in their personal life, right? In this case, it's the doctor's wife. It's like going to spread to the people around the victim here. With Carter, yeah, she's in this position. She's helping Reese and Finch. She's doing a lot of these things that are going outside the line of the law for the greater good. But she's at this point where it might affect the people outside of her job. It might affect the people in her personal life. So I never even thought of comparing the doctor lady's predicament with Carter specifically, but I do think it actually kind of links up kind of nicely now that I'm thinking about it. So yeah, so fun episode. Yeah, I had a good time watching Carter, or so not Carter, watching Fusco completely pick on this police officer in the park. Turns out he's not a real cop, obviously, but in the moment it was fun watching him hit his hat off and yell at him and just be a dick. I enjoyed that. I don't know why I enjoyed that, but I did. I also got a kick of all the stuff with Leon and him being buddy-buddy with the dog. Entertaining enough. Curious to see if we get him coming back as someone who can help down the line with something else. Again, we're building this idea of the allies are starting to stack up that will help the two main characters because inherently what they're doing is good and they're earning the trust of the people around them. So anyway, there you go. That's the show. That's the episode of the week. Thank you very much for joining me. It is a pleasure. You can support all the content, of course, over at patreon.com/MaileFuzzTV and help keep all the content coming, get some bonus episodes of some of the movie podcasts, and of course, a monthly review for myself for Columbo, which is a fun show. And you can also hit the like button. Helps out a bunch if you do, so please do. That is me. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Have you got any vanilla?